Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone who's taken part today. Don't say this very often, but I count it a real privilege just to stand here and to be able to share with you week by week. And just been moved by so many things today. It's been just a wonderful time together. We've come to the final session in our series on emotions, and we hope you found it relevant, you found it helpful. That was certainly our purpose in running it. And hopefully today, as we look at two more emotions, our final two, this will be an encouragement, blessing to you as well. Our first reading today is quite a lengthy one, but I need to remind you of the context in which a particularly courageous act took place. So I'm reading to you from Esther chapter 4, and I want to read verses 5 to 17. If you're following it on your tablet or your phone, you might even have a Bible in front of you. How about that? Esther 4, 5 to 17. I thought that was looking a bit blurry. That's better. Then Esther summoned Martock, one of the king's eunuchs. Can't help thinking when I get to heaven, I'm going to apologize for a lot of people for how I pronounce their names. Some of these Old Testament ones, they're tricky. He was one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend Esther and ordered him to find out what was troubling her uncle, Mordecai, and why. Then verse 7 carries on. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. If you don't know the story, Queen Esther was an exiled Jewess, so a member of the nation Haman wanted to destroy. Martock went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said, and then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Over to the New Testament, just two more verses from 1 Peter chapter 3, and I'm reading verses 8 and 9. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. Thanks, Sam. In the past few weeks, our nation has witnessed a great outpouring of sympathy, feelings of sorrow and pity for some of the most privileged people in the land, as well as for ourselves. Countless flowers have been laid in public places. Numerous cards have been sent. Hundreds of thousands of school children have written poems and drawn pictures to express their feelings. Special services have been conducted up and down the land. And all because one person, albeit a very special and much loved person, had died. at the grand old age of 96. That's a very obvious example, isn't it, of what we Brits call sympathy, which is one of the emotions we'll be thinking about today. So some 2,500 years ago, in the Middle Eastern land of Persia, as we've heard, a much younger queen hit the headlines. Her Persian name was Esther. Her Jewish name was Hadassah. And she was an exiled Jewess who was taken into the harem of King Ahasuerus, otherwise known as Xerxes I. Warned by her uncle that a scheming evil court official was hatching a plan that would see her people completely annihilated, Esther didn't just feel sorry for them. She didn't just feel sympathy. She acted. Risking her own life, she approached her husband unbidden, having determined to plead the cause of her fellow Jews. And that, I want to suggest to you, is a wonderful example of courageous compassion, which is the other emotion, similar but different, that we'll be focusing on today. Thanks, Sam. So, sympathy and compassion. What exactly are they? How do they differ? Why should believers express them even more freely than most people? Let's begin with sympathy. I came across this helpful definition in an article on the Cornerstone Counselling website. I quote, "Sympathy are feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune." Feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. In other words, it's not just the feelings that we have for a friend or even a stranger when they lose a loved one. It is that, of course, but it's much wider, much broader than that. A friend fails to land the job that he or she had set their heart on. What do we feel? We feel sympathy for them. A colleague at work is diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. What's our emotional response? We feel sympathy for them. Even to someone who supports Leicester City FC, who are bottom of the league, having gained only 1 point from 7 games, we might say, "You have my sympathies." Why? Because we pity them. We feel sorry for them to support a team that's having such a run. Perhaps there's nothing we can actually do to improve any of those circumstances, but we can commiserate. We can sympathize with those who are facing them. That's sympathy. That's being sympathetic. We may not have experienced ourselves the very same set of circumstances, but we can imagine how those people feel as they pass through them. How difficult it must be for them. And we can let that sufferer know that we feel for them in their upset, in their pain. I can only find 3 uses of sympathy-type words in the New Testament, and I read one of them to you earlier. Here it is again from 1 Peter 3. "Finally, all of you," said Peter, "be like-minded." That's another talk. "Be sympathetic. Love one another. Be compassionate and humble." Although Peter's instruction to be sympathetic is the only one of its kind that I could find in the New Testament, that doesn't mean to say that we can label it as of lesser importance. The fact it only occurs once. Indeed, feeling sympathy is surely a Christian emotion. Expressing sympathy is surely a Christian action. Referring to a period of fierce persecution in the first century, the writer of Hebrews says this, "For you showed sympathy," sympatheo is the Greek word. "You showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property." It's a Christian attitude. It's a Christian action to sympathize with those who are in trouble and in difficulty. Again, a little earlier in his letter, the same writer says of Jesus in chapter 4 and 15 of Hebrews, "For we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with us for our weaknesses." Sympatheo, same word. It's a Christ-like action. Came across an article by another person I'd never heard of, Keegan Moisia. I don't know who he is, but he says this, quite interesting. He says, "Pity can often be condescending or belittling and could cause a person to elevate themselves above the one with the greater misfortune." Sympathy, however, shows thoughtfulness and means that one is feeling sorry for another's hurt. It may also give rise to a verbal provision of comfort and assurance. That in itself, just that in itself, can be a real blessing to people who are quietly enduring suffering in silence. As for the original New Testament word that Peter and the writer of Hebrews use, sympatheo or sympathizo, it literally means to suffer along with. To suffer along with. Now, who in the Bible had 3 friends who, at least to begin with, came and suffered along with him? Job, whispered someone in the congregation who's still awake. Job 2, 11 to 13. When Job's 3 friends heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, and they were many, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could barely recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes. They sprinkled dust on their heads. Here it is. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days. And no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. I'm getting emotional just sharing that with you. How brilliant was that? They just sat for a week and suffered with him. If only they'd left it at that. But at least they went. At least they wept. At least they mourned along with him. They couldn't send an email or even a card. So they got on their camels and they joined him on his ash heap. And that's true sympathy. Possibly even empathy. What's the difference? Freelance writer Laurie Freeland put it like this: when we look down into someone else's trench and feel sorrow and sadness, that's sympathy. When we jump into that same trench and get dirty, that's empathy. Subtle difference, isn't there? And in my book, not that I've ever written a book or ever likely to, that's more than halfway to compassion. Sympathy, empathy, compassion. But before we officially get to compassion, let's ask ourselves a very awkward question. Namely, am I truly sympathetic? Am I obeying the word's instruction? Am I following Jesus' example by being alert to the needs of others and the hurts of others, and somehow sharing in their pain, mourning with those who mourn? Perhaps sharing my love, my care, an arm around the shoulder in the midst of their miserable mishap or difficult diagnosis or loss of a loved one. One web writer put it like this: it's healthy to be bothered at the fact that someone else is hurting. I'll say that with a different emphasis. It's healthy to be bothered at the fact that someone else is hurting. Indeed, it's more than healthy, it's godly. It's godly. You've probably heard of Tim Keller, wonderful writer, church pastor, theologian, apologist. And Tim Keller said this: Christ literally walked in our shoes and entered into our affliction. Those who will not help others until they're destitute reveal that Christ's love has not yet turned them into the sympathetic people the gospel should make them. That's pretty challenging. Those who will not help others until they're destitute reveal that Christ's love has not yet turned them into the sympathetic persons the gospel should make them. Sympathy doesn't usually cost a lot of money, a moment's thought, a few minutes' time, price of a call or a card or a cake. There will probably be some who have the gift of sympathy. It's not listed in the New Testament, but I'm sure there is one. But we don't need the gift of sympathy in order to give it. Just a dozen or so prayerfully chosen words. If we did it for the members of the Queen's family, Can't we do it for the members of the King of Kings family, our own brothers and sisters? So to our second word, and in many ways a stronger word, certainly a more frequently word as far as the Bible's concerned, and it's the word compassion. Apparently, the late Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame was once on an aeroplane when an infant screamed and wouldn't stop. We've all been there. Even though the mother and the flight attendants tried every trick they could think of, this little one would not stop screaming. Finally, the colonel asked if he could hold the baby. And its mother agreed, and Colonel Sanders gently rocked it to sleep. A little bit later, a passenger said to him, "We all appreciate what you did for us." And Sanders replied, "I didn't do it for us, I did it for the baby." How brilliant is that? What a great answer. And what a lovely thing to do. Let's all go out and buy a bargain bucket. But seriously, what Sanders did was compassionate. And it was driven by his compassionate emotion for the baby. Not for the mother, not for the fellow passengers, for the baby who was in such distress. A distressed child that really could do nothing for itself. It was a simple but warm-hearted act that took the stress out of distress. Finally, all of you, said Peter, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, and be compassionate and humble. Now, I realize orders aren't very popular these days. People don't like to be ordered around. It's bad enough at work, let alone outside of work. But this is not a polite request that Peter's giving here. It's an apostolic order. For fans of Dad's Army, it's more Captain Waring than Sergeant Wilson, if you know what I mean. Be compassionate, says Peter, very firmly. The word he used was virtually unpronounceable. I think it's pronounced something like this. Eusplanchnos. Now, I'm not insulting you. That's the start of the word, EU. Eusplanchnos, an adjective that was related to the verb splanchnitzamai. Have a drink after that. You remember that word, possibly, if you've got really good memories, from a talk I gave just over a year ago about the compassion of Jesus, when we were looking at the qualities of Jesus. And I mentioned that word, splanchnitzamai. It's a word that has to do with our viscera, our innards, our internal organs, heart, liver, lungs, because that's where the Greeks believed our deepest emotions came from those organs. So, if sympathy causes us to feel sorry for someone, what might compassion drive us to do? Well, I want to tell you a story. I have to confess it's borrowed heavily from the master storyteller. A man was walking home from a bus stop in Peckham at 11 o'clock in the evening when he was set upon by a gang. They roughed him up with their fists and a cosh, and they removed his suit, his rings, his Gucci shoes. They stuffed his Rolex wallet and iPhone in a carrier bag, then legged it back to Hackney. 20 minutes later, a vicar was riding his bike along the same bit of road. But seeing the man lying there, he swerved around him. Another 10 minutes passed, and the pastor of the local free church came by, having just left a lengthy leaders' meeting. He saw the man at the roadside, but couldn't stop as the next day's diary was already full. But a young West Indian rap artist saw the victim from his motorbike and was filled with compassion for him. He slammed on his brakes, quickly dialed 999 and asked for an ambulance. And having retrieved from the pannier on his bike his first aid kit, he carefully turned the man over, probably shouldn't have done that, but he did, and asked him if he could help him in the meantime. Don't worry, he said, I'll wait with you till the paramedics arrive. 2 hours later, he was still waiting. But eventually, he accompanied the stranger to the hospital before calling an Uber, got it right that time, an Uber to take himself back to his motorbike. So what did the rapper's Splanchnitzamai, and I've got to take this off, I'm roasting here. What did the rapper Splanchnitzamai, his compassion for the victim, drive him to do? To put it another way, what was Jesus teaching about his compassion, about our compassion? Well, As with the Samaritan in Jesus' story, it led the rapper to do three things. Number one, as with the Samaritan in Jesus' parable, his splanchnitzomai caused him some inconvenience, did it not? Wherever he was heading on his motorbike, he was significantly delayed. The church pastor in my retelling of the story didn't want to stop because he was late, because of the leaders' meeting, and he had a full day the next day. In other words, his commitment to his schedule was greater than his compassion. That's a bit close to the bone. Too busy to listen, too busy to help, too busy even to pray for the guy. May God help us not to avoid those appointments that he adds to our list because they're inconvenient. Secondly, the man's compassion cost him some of his own money that he couldn't claim back on his expenses. In the case of my rapper, the cost of an Uber and some items for his first aid kit. In Jesus' story, the cost of a stay at a local inn. There's no doubt about it, folks, sometimes demonstrating compassion will cost us money, not just minutes. But Jesus was teaching us that unlike sympathy, compassion moves us to take definite action. It's never satisfied simply by feeling sorry for somebody. It has to do something to try and make things better for the person who's suffering. So it caused some inconvenience, cost some of his money, and thirdly, it caused him to jeopardize his own safety. As with the Samaritan on that Jericho road, how did the biker know that the thieves weren't lying in wait nearby, ready to rob any unsuspecting, helpful passerby as they tended the victim? The application being that demonstrating compassion may sometimes entail a physical risk. As we well know, a huge number of people do that every day as part of their occupational career. It's an occupational hazard. It's part and parcel of their job. Police officers, firefighters, nurses, doctors, military people, to name but a few. Whereas what Jesus was talking about was acts of compassion that we should be ready to do simply because we're human beings. And especially on account of our commitment to follow him, who is the ultimate Good Samaritan, who came by us in our pain and our distress, and tended us and saved us. Now, having said all of that, and without wanting to take anything away from all of that, I do remember a chat I had with one of our lady members here not long after I came to MCF, so we're going back about 20 years. It was a lady that I would suggest was suffering from compassion fatigue. Someone whose big heart for the hurting and the poor and the distressed was about to burst on account of the sheer volume of need that she had become aware of. It was as though the weight of the world was being carried by this woman on her shoulders to such a great extent, actually, it was damaging her faith and beginning to lead her to question the goodness of God. Friends, with the best will in the world, that's not our job. It isn't. As the old spiritual put it, he's got the whole world in his hands, which is fine because God can cope with it. We can't, and he's never asked us to. So if you're suffering from compassion overload, if your emotional tank is running on empty, cancel some of those circulars. Stop Googling for news of floods and fires and famines. Give yourself a break, honestly, because if you don't, it may break you. And as far as I know, that dear lady's not walking with the Lord today. I find that really sad. But I want to finish with a good news story. It isn't exactly new, about 30 years old, but I believe it's true, and I've done a little bit of checking on this. In March 1992, A couple called Jeff and Christy Leland from the city of Seattle in the United States found out that their baby boy, Michael, had cancer and needed a bone marrow transplant. His sister, Amy, not much older than him, was a perfect match for this operation, but the cost of it was $200,000, and Jeff's medical insurance at the school where he worked didn't cover this procedure. To make things worse, baby Michael needed this transplant done within 90 days in order to survive the cancer. Damien, a 7th grade boy who walked with a bit of a limp and struggled with special educational needs, heard about little Michael and visited the Leland home. "Mr. Leland," he said, "don't make a big deal out of this. Your baby's in trouble. I want to help out." And Damien, that kid that other kids teased, put his hand in his pocket, reached out and stuffed 12 $5 bills into Jeff's hand. $60. It was his whole life savings. Word got out about Damien's gifts. Some other kids organized a walkathon. Others contacted a local paper. Others did a car wash. And soon the kids' wave of compassion poured out across Seattle. By late May, local TV stations had picked up this story, and the response was overwhelming. And only 4 weeks after Damien's gift of $60, the Michael Leland Fund totaled over $220,000. Needless to say, Michael got the marrow transplant, and he lived. But Damien, the boy who gave all he had so another could live, died shortly afterwards as a result of complications with an infection in one of his legs, which is why he limped. However, before he died, he trusted Christ as his Savior through contact with Michael's family. Amazing. I guess things a bit like that happen all over the world all the time. We don't get to hear a lot about it, a lot of them. But what tremendous compassion from that little boy who was teased at school, had special needs, walked with a limp, raided his piggy bank, took everything out and gave it for this little lad who needed bone marrow. Sympathy and compassion, they're not gifts. They're emotions. And even a child can express them. So may God give us grace to exhibit both to the benefit and the blessing of our fellowship, our community, and even to the wider world. Amen.